Welcome to I'm Your Target Demographic. Today we're going to be talking about Spider-Man, the Amazing Spider-Man, which is owned by Sony, and the third Amazing Spider-Man movie has been pushed back. But in place of that means that the next Spider-Man movie is going to be something called the Sinister Six. And if you're not familiar, the Sinister Six focuses on 6 Spider-Man villains that kind of come together and then face off against Spider-Man. This is kind of the first time this has ever been done in a movie, that it's really the villain's story. We don't know if Spider-Man will even be in the movie. So now we're going to talk about who we think are going to be in the movie and who should be in the movie. So let's talk about the Sinister Six. Now the first big question, should Spider-Man be in the Sinister Six movie? My answer is yes. But does that mean that Peter Parker needs to be in the movie? No. If they include snippets of the villains interacting with Spider-Man, how he ruined their lives, things like that, but it's all CG, maybe get Andrew Garfield to come in and do a day of voiceover work, you could still get that Spider-Man feel without revolving around him. So I'm totally pro Spider-Man, maybe anti Peter Parker for the Sinister Six movie. But now the tricky thing, if Spider-Man is in the movie, we are going to be inclined to root for him. So how do you have 6 villains, and how do you as a screenwriter make them empathetic enough to root for them? Every time Spider-Man shows up, I'm going to be like, yep, go Spider-Man. Not, hey, go Green Goblin. Especially considering the villains that we've seen in Amazing Spider-Man, both 1 and 2, aren't super empathetic or likable at all. So having them be the center of a movie may not work. So question number 2, can a movie about just the villains work? Again, if Spider-Man's in the movie, we're going to be rooting for him, so the key is to make them relatable and empathetic. So once we start talking about our villains, we'll see if that's a plausible task to do. And now for the rest of the video, we're going to conquer question number 3, which is who should be in the Sinister Six. There's a few that we already know, and there's a few that have been hinted at, but let's brainstorm. The first one is likely the Green Goblin, who showed up at the end of Amazing Spider-Man 2, Dane DeHaan. The Green Goblin was never really involved with the Sinister Six, at least most incarnations of it, but here in the movies it makes sense for him to be their ringleader. He's the funding behind the whole thing. A lot of villains are being created out of Oscorp, so it makes sense that we'll see the Green Goblin. But again, he was not likable, not relatable. Him being the star of that film is a major problem. So we need some other characters that are likable. Another villain that will likely appear in the Sinister Six is the Rhino, who barely showed up in Amazing Spider-Man 2 in one of the most disappointing climaxes of any movie ever, but we'll likely get him to show up in Sinister Six. Paul Giamatti looked to have a fun time doing it, so hopefully he comes back, and hopefully he gets a little bit more to do. Interestingly enough, Rhino was also not a key member of the Sinister Six in the comic books, so we're already kind of a little behind. He was also not very likable in the movies. Next up would probably be the villain Dr. Octopus, or Doc Ock. Dr. Octopus appeared in Spider-Man 2 with the old Tobey Maguire movies, and Spider-Man 2 is probably one of my favorite superhero movies of all time. Incredible. So there's some big shoes to fill, but Dr. Octopus makes sense in this world. If he was a scientist for Oscorp, he's the one that's creating the Rhino's mech suit, he's the one that's creating the gliders, he's the brains behind their operation. A lot of these other villains are tech-based, so he can be the one that's kind of creating all these things, a little more behind the scenes, eventually creating these octopus arms to help him build things. Super cool visually. We haven't really met this character yet in Amazing Spider-Man, so they can cast, hopefully, a big name. We did get a brief glimpse in Amazing Spider-Man 2 of Dr. Octopus's arms in some hallway somewhere in like a laboratory or whatever, so it's pretty obvious that he'll be in the movie. We also got a pretty good look at the wings of a villain called the Vulture. Now the Vulture is essentially a guy that has metallic wings, and he flies around and causes havoc. Not a lot to do, but it's tied to technology, so it makes sense in this story. And with 6 villains, they can't all be super destructive. You know, maybe he'll be a scout, spy kind of character, who knows. But he was in a lot of incarnations of the Sinister Six in the comic books. He was almost always in them. A few different characters were the Vulture. You know, it's kind of a title that's been passed on, so they can play around with what that character is that takes over that title. But there's a lot of possibilities with the Vulture. Now, when you ask a fan, who they want to see face off against Spider-Man, one of the most often requested villains is someone called Kraven the Hunter. And Kraven is essentially a hunter that looks for big game, and he hunts Spider-Man as the most kind of rewarding game out there. So there's this big storyline of him hunting and tracking and luring Spider-Man around the city, which is very cool. So it'd be cool to see a villain that their goal wasn't money or fame, but it's just to take down Spider-Man as essentially the largest trophy they can. Now, tied to Kraven is his stepbrother, who is a villain called Chameleon. Now, Chameleon, basically all he can do is he kind of wears masks and things to look like other people, so he's kind of a illusionist. So he doesn't really have a lot of skills to work with. And in the credits of Amazing Spider-Man 2, you see kind of gear from the Sinister Six that leads you to believe who's going to be in the movie. And one of them is this mask that looks just like the Chameleon's mask. But there's also this smoke that's coming kind of through. And smoke is a big indicator of another villain named Mysterio. Mysterio was a highly dramatic, theatrical villain known for creating illusions and traps, and he wore like a fishbowl for a head and a big cape. Very eccentric, and I don't know if Mysterio would work in a movie, but it'd be interesting if they kind of combine the characters, so maybe it is the Chameleon, but he's also known for these big tricks and illusions, and kind of give him some of these qualities that Mysterio had to make one solid villain instead of two kind of C-list villains. Now you'll notice that absent from this lineup is Electro, the villain from Amazing Spider-Man 2, mostly because I doubt Jamie Foxx would come back to do a movie like this. I mean, we're lucky if we get Paul Giamatti, we're lucky if we get Dane DeHaan, so we'll see, but I doubt Jamie Foxx will come back, even though Electro was almost always in the Sinister Six. Someone else that's missing from this lineup is the Sandman, which was in the first Spider-Man trilogy in number 3, which we don't talk about. I didn't have a problem with Sandman in Spider-Man 3, I had a problem with Venom. I thought Sandman was well done, it looked cool, I thought Thomas Hayden Church did a great job. But I think it's still too early to bring back that villain, and it didn't make sense with any of the clips that were shown, kind of cluing people into who might appear in Sinister Six. There was nothing that resembled Sandman, so I doubt we'll see him come to the big screen in Sinister Six. So those are my ideas. Some villains that we might see in the Sinister Six. But again, the big questions remain. Are these villains that we would root for as the heroes in their own movie? I don't see myself rooting for Dane DeHaan's Green Goblin. I don't see myself rooting for Paul Giamatti's Rhino. If Spider-Man is around, I'm rooting for him, which makes it a hard movie to sell. If you don't include Spider-Man at all, you've got even a bigger problem. So there's a lot going against this movie, but it could pay off big if they make the characters likable and if they manage to subvert this idea that Spider-Man is the one you're going to root for. So there's some big hurdles. And since Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2 weren't super great, they've got some work to do. So we'll see, there's still a lot of time left until Sinister Six releases any solid information. So for right now, those are just some ideas. For other info and weekly movie reviews, articles, things like that, head over to I'mYourTargetDemographic.com or subscribe to this channel to see other videos that you might be interested in. Thanks for watching.